Hey everyone, it's Talks from critshappen.com. Thanks for watching and welcome back. We've got another critical situation this week, but as you can see by what's laid out in front of me, this is not Mage Wars. The last two critical situations have all been around key strategic moments inside of Mage Wars. This week we're going to look at one of my favorite games called Seasons. Seasons was put out last year by Asmodee right near the time of Gen Con. In fact, most of us that were at Gen Con ran our little piggly feet off to get to the booth, and not many people got there because there was just so few amount of copies. I picked mine up after Gen Con and I've had an absolute blast playing this game since then. We haven't done a review on Seasons because we just haven't had the time or the chance to, but if anyone were to ask me, I would immediately say this is a crit of a game. For multiple reasons, but we're not here to give this a review. We're here to talk about something strategic. What I always heard about was the beginning of the game, which is where each player would be dealt out 9 cards. And during this drafting, quote-unquote, period, the players are going to take one card and pass. And what's going to happen is at the end of drafting these 9 cards, you're going to then separate them into 3 stacks of 3. Well, what I always heard was that this game was very hard to pick up on because of the element of drafting. After you had your 9 cards, you would then separate them out into 3 stacks. So I would go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3 if I could count. And then we would put a 2 token and a 3 token on the ones that I would have chosen for my second year and my third year in Seasons. For anyone unfamiliar with Seasons, the wheel here, the Seasons wheel, has a 1, a 2, and a 3 for each year. Once you cross over from the end of fall to the beginning of winter, you will move this up to 2 and then once again up to 3. When you move into 2, you get the cards that you placed under your year 2 token. When you move into 3, you get the cards that you placed under your 3 token. Well, the problem that I always had was people would say, this is a hard game to learn because you're not sure which cards to use for year 2 or year 3, and you got to learn the cards, you got to learn the combos. But I never heard how to fix that. I never heard how to draft. What were good things at the beginning of the game? What were good things in the middle of the game? What were good things at the end of the game? So what we're going to do is walk you through a short 2-player draft. This is completely random. I completely shuffled this deck. I have no idea what the 9 cards are that each player just got, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at them, and then we're not only going to show you some of the choices we're going to make, but we're also going to talk about some of the choices into which year we would put them in. So would they be one of the 3 cards we'd start with? Would they be one of the 3 cards in year 2? Or one of the 3 cards in year 3, and why? So let's jump in and take a look at the cards that we got for the player that is orange to start with. So let's start off by taking a look at the cards the orange player got. There's 2 types of cards if you're unfamiliar with the game. There are purple magic items and orange familiars. Magic items will generally help you, and familiars will generally inhibit or hurt your opponents. That's not to say all of them are like that, but just a majority of them are. Let's take a look at the 9 cards first, and then we'll talk about some choices as to what the first card the orange player could take is. One key thing to note is that when you're drafting cards, you don't have to draft a card and then say, okay, I'm going to put it in year 1, year 2, or year 3. So, while you're going to start the game with a token for year 2 and year 3 cards to be put under, you don't have to put them under that when you draft a card. You're going to take all 9 and then you'll choose how to separate them out. But let's take a look at the cards real quick. Starting from the upper left, we have the Pendant of Ragnar. The Pendant of Ragnar will give you 0 crystals if it's in play on your side at the end of the game. That's what the number in the upper left is. Then you see the cost to bring it into play, which is a water, a fire, and an air. And then it has a come into play ability as denoted by the symbol in the lower left, and it says gain 1 energy for each of your magic items in play, except for the Pendant of Ragnar. Good card, but possibly not good at the beginning of the game. Next we have Potion of Life. Potion of Life is a magic item that will give you 0 crystals at the end of the game. It has a activated ability, which is the gear in the lower left. It costs 2 earth to come into play, and it says activate it, sacrifice the Potion of Life to transmute each of the energy tokens in your reserve into 4 crystals. Now crystals are really good again because that's how you win the game. Then we have the Potion of Dreams. The Potion of Dreams is a 0 crystal magic item. It costs 2 air to come into play, and it too has an activated ability. It says sacrifice the Potion of Dreams and discard all of your energy to summon a power card for free, which is really nice if you have something that maybe costs a lot of one type of energy you don't have, or if it costs vary amounts of energy, meaning one of each, for example, that you may not have. Now we get down into the Cursed Treaties of Aris. This, if it's in your area at the end of the game, will give you -10 crystals, which is pretty dangerous. So what does this do? Well, for 1 water, we can put it into play, and it has a come into play ability that says gain 2 energy tokens and 10 crystals. You then increase your summoning gauge by 1, and the higher your summoning gauge, the more cards you can have out in front of you. If the Cursed Treaties of Aris is sacrificed, discard all the energy tokens in your reserve. So, while that only costs 1 blue and will give you a lot of energy tokens and a lot of crystals at the very beginning of the game, you're going to want to get rid of it at some point, because it's either going to give you that -10 and you're going to have to get rid of all of your energy tokens in your reserve at the time. If timed right, it can be very powerful, but you can tell that that's a very situational card. Okay, so let's get into the familiars. We know the 4 magic items we have. The familiars, we start off with Amsug Longneck, who is a really awesome looking little baby whelp dragon. He will give you 8 crystals if he is in play on your side at the end of the game. He costs a water and a fire to come into play, and has a come into play ability that says each player, you included, takes one of their magic items and puts it back into their hand. Well, that already shows us a really neat combo between Amsug and the Pendant of Ragnar. But remember, we're only going to get to take 1 card from here, and we're going to have to give these to the remaining 8 to our opponent, who is the green player, and they're going to have to pick. So if we took the Pendant, they could take Amsug, or if we take Amsug, they could take the Pendant. So there's a gamble, as always, with drafting. Next we have the Air Elemental, and he will give you 12 crystals if he's in play. He costs 3 air to come in. Shocker, an air elemental costs a lot of air. And he has a come into play ability that says all the energy tokens present in the reserves of your opponents become air energy. That is a great way to really mess with someone who is potentially building up multiple different types of energy to play cards that are going to require different types, because then they're stuck with all air. Of course, it could be really bad if they need all air. Next, we have Figrum, the Avaricious. Figrum is really fun. You'll notice that he has a different varying cost depending on the amount of players that are in the game. So if there's 2 players in the game, he will cost 3 crystals. That's what that little kind of flame looking thing is. It's actually a crystal. If there's 3 players, he will cost 6, and if there are 4 players, he will cost 9. Well, we know in this game we were starting off with 2 players, so he's going to cost 3. He says each change of season, each of your opponents must give you 1 crystal. So every time you cross over on that dial from winter to spring, from spring to summer, from summer to fall, you're going to gain a crystal from each of your opponents. This is really powerful in multiplayer games. For a 2-player game, it's not bad, but you're only going to have that 1 potential crystal coming to you. Then you have Naria, the Prophetess. Naria will cost you 3 crystals to put into play, and she will give you 8 crystals at the end of the game if she is in your play area, and has a come into play ability that says draw as many power cards as there are players. So in this case it would be 2. Put 1 of them in your hand and give the rest out to every other player. So beneficial, but also beneficial to our opponents. And then finally we have Thieving Fairies. Again, a variable cost in crystals depending on the amount of players that are in the game. And it has a recurring ability that says each time an opponent activates one of their power cards, they must give you 1 crystal, gain an extra 1 crystal at that moment. So that's actually really interesting in terms of racking up some of the crystals if there's a potential for them to have a lot of activated cards. Well, if we look in the hand, we only had 2 cards that had an activation, and both of them involve sacrificing. So unless the green player got a lot of cards that have activated abilities, which we don't know yet, that may not be that good of a card to take from the very beginning in the get-go. So already I like the fact of the Pendant and Amsug as a potential to go ahead and start a combo if I wanted to do that. But I also really like the Cursed Treaties because it's a bit of a gamble. Now that would be an aggressive first card to take because you're going to put yourself in a position of gaining 2 energy and 10 crystals, but you're also going to be in a position of potentially losing 10 crystals if it's still in front of you at the end of the game. So I think the safe thing right now would be to either take the pendant or take Amsug. And since Amsug is pretty valuable and only costs 2 different energy types to put into play, I think we're going to go ahead and start with Amsug. So we'll take him and put him into our draft. He will be face down. Our opponent doesn't know what we've taken. And then we'll take a look at what the yellow player will have chosen for their first set. Now, on the way back, what I'm hoping for here is that the Pendant of Power is going to be in this set when it comes back. If it's not, I very well may take either the Potion of Dreams or the Potion of Life as a next card, because that too could be very good starting cards as well. But I am trying to build for year 2 or year 3, taking Amsug and looking for combos down the road, hoping that the green player is going to pass me a card that will be good at the start of the turn as well in year 1. So let's take a look at what the green player has. Okay, quite a different set of cards for the green player. We have a lot of amulets in this hand, which is pretty interesting, so we'll have to see how this works out. And not only that, but we have 8 magic items and only 1 familiar. Now mind you, the yellow player has no clue what was taken by the orange player yet and hasn't seen their cards. So let's go and start again from the upper left to the lower right, and we'll show you what we've got here. The first card we have is the Elemental Amulet, and it will give you 2 crystals if in play at the end of your game. It will cost you a water and or an earth and or a air or fire and or an air. So an interesting odd cost, but it is a little flexible. And what the reasoning behind that is it has a come into play ability. If you've used this type of energy, then on a water being spent, you can gain 2 energy tokens. On an earth being spent, you can gain 5 crystals. On a yellow or an air being spent, fire being spent, you can draw a power card. And on an air being spent, you can increase your summoning gauge by 1. Now what this means is a lot of flexibility. If I had a water, an earth, a fire, and an air, I could spend all of them and gain all of those effects. I can't spend multiple, so I can't spend 2 earth and get 10 crystals. So I would have to spend 1 and or this and or that and or that. But that is a really good flexible card that's really, really powerful. Next, you see 2 identical cards. We have 2 Amulets of Air. Both of them will provide you 6 crystals if in play at the end of the game. They're both cost of 2 air to put into play, and both have the ability when they come into play to increase your summoning gauge by 2. And again, the higher your summoning gauge, the more cards you can have out in front of you. Next we have the Amulet of Fire. This costs 2 fire to put into play and has a come into play ability of draw 4 power cards and add 1 to your hand and discard the rest. So if you're looking to multiply or change out the number of cards you have, that is really, really good. But remember, for every card you have in your hand at the end of the game that you haven't cast, you could get negative crystals, which would be very, very bad. Next you have the Balance of Ishtar, and this is one of the more interesting cards in the game. It costs 6 crystals and has an activated ability that says discard 4 identical energy tokens to gain 12 crystals. That could be very interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. Then you have the Sealed Chest of Urm. It costs 2 water and an earth to put into play. And it says at the end of the game, if you only have magic items in play, then gain 20 crystals. Well, that's really interesting for this player because obviously looking at this hand, there's only 1 familiar. So, while they don't know what the other player has in their hand that they're about to pass them for the 8 cards remaining, they could take a gamble thinking there's not a lot of elementals and they would be drafting a lot of magic items to go ahead and gain that. He will also give you 10 crystals on top of that at the end of the game in the upper left, as you note. Then we have the Potion of Life, which was also in the other hand, which again, 0 cost or 0 crystals at the end of the game, 2 earth, and it can sacrifice the Potion of Life to transmute each of your energy tokens in your reserve into 4 crystals. Then we have the Mirror of the Seasons. This is a magic item that costs 3 crystals to put into play. It will give you 8 at the end of the game when it's in play. And it says activate. discard X crystals, transform X identical energy tokens from your reserve into X identical energy tokens of another type. So that works really interesting with the balance of Ishtar in terms of transmuting some of our crystals or transmuting some of our energy tokens and being able to then use the balance of Ishtar to gain crystals. And then we have another Amsug Longneck. So we have another one of that great little familiar who's going to give each player, including yourself, the ability to take one magic item back into their hand. So, this is an interesting setup. The Elemental Amulet is something I really like as an early game card because it gives you a lot of flexibility. It's also a really good card in the second year to give you the option to use some energy that you've already taken up on and invested in to then gain some more advantages. So I really like that. But I also really like the Amulet of Air and the Amulet of Fire. Amulets are always good opening cards to draft because they're always going to be valuable, they're always going to help you out, whether you choose to play them early or whether you choose to play them late. So I think what we're going to do is, instead of taking a risk of taking an Amulet of Air now and missing out on something good, we know that if we pass this to our opponent, the worst that they're going to do is take one of the Amulets of Air, leaving one to us when it comes back. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the Elemental Amulet for the yellow player. Now I may choose to use that in my first year, I may choose to use that in my second or my third year. But let's go ahead and flip, and now we'll talk a little bit about why we're going to make our second choice. Okay, so now these cards have been passed to the orange player who has Amsug Longneck already drafted. So now he's looking at a lot of magical items. And you'll remember that Amsug allows us to take a magical item back in our hand. Well, there's 3 different magical items here that have a come into play ability. We have both Amulets of Air and we have the Amulet of Fire. The Amulet of Fire being able to draw 4 cards, pick one, and put the one in our hand and discarding the rest is pretty good. But knowing that if I take an Amulet of Air, my opponent is probably going to take the other Amulet of Air, it could be a nice combination there to also be able to pull that back and increase my summoning gauge by 2 again, which could be really interesting. I obviously don't need another Amsug, and the Potion of Life, while interesting, I know potentially is going to come back to me as well again. So, I'm already looking at the balance of Ishtar and the Mirror of the Seasons going, that might be a problem later on if my opponent decides to draft those. But I know that I also passed my opponent quite a bit of familiars, and I know that this Sealed Chest of is probably not going to be as valuable as someone may think it is. So I think the right thing for us right now to choose is go ahead and take the Amulet of Air. So that'll give us Amsug and the Amulet of Air as our first 2 picks. Let's go ahead and take a look at what the green player is going to do with the cards passed to them from the orange player now for their second pick. So here we are with the next cards for the green player, who's drafted an Elemental Amulet as their first card. There's a few things that jump out at me. The first thing is that I remember I really liked the cards that I passed, the Balance of Ishtar and the Mirror of the Seasons. And I noticed that there's an Air Elemental here, who again is going to turn all of the opponent's energy tokens into air. Well, if I can somehow ensure my opponent gets that, the Balance of Ishtar becomes a pretty valuable card on the way back. However, my opponent knows that he passed me an air element, so he may take that Balance of Ishtar trying to do the same thing. So that's going to be an interesting fate. Now remember, my opponent just took an Amulet of Air, which is what I was really banking on them taking, so maybe or maybe not this plan is going to work out. But looking at the cards that I have in front of me now, it's very interesting. Because when I think about the Thieving Fairies, for instance, I see that each time an opponent activates a card, then I'm going to gain 1 crystal from them and 1 crystal from the reserve. Well, and there's not really a reserve, you just gain a crystal and go up. But the challenge here is the amount of activated cards that are in the game. Now, there were 2 Potions of Life, 1 in each set of 9 cards. There's also a Potion of Dreams, which are only activated once because they're all sacrificed. So it's really only going to leave 2 cards, the Mirror and the Balance of Ishtar, that have any kind of activation. So the Thieving Fairies start to become less and less valuable when you see what's available to you. However, the Pennant of Ragnar is looking very interesting to me. I know that I passed an Amsug, and if I could get him back, that might be very powerful. I know that because there's 2 Amulets of Air that I passed my opponent, it's still going to be very valuable for them to take an Amulet of Air. So I think the next thing that I am going to take as a player here to go along with my elemental amulet is my Pendant of Ragnar. And again, that's going to gain 1 energy for each of your magic items in play, which goes very well with the elemental amulet already. So that's going to give me a very good starting set of cards, and then we're going to pass over. Let's move a little more into the draft, where both players have taken their 9 cards, and now we have to choose how to pair them off, or actually set them off in 2 sets of 3. So here are the 9 cards that our orange player has ended up with. We've got an interesting set of cards here. Not quite what we hoped for, but let's take a look. We've got the Elemental Amulet, the Amulet of Air, and Figrim. We have the Air Elemental, Narya, and Amsug, and then we have the Mirror of Seasons, the Pendant of Ragnar, and the Balance of Ishtar. Now I've gone ahead and set these up as Year 1, Year 2, and Year 3, and I'll explain a little bit why. But part of the Critical Situations video that I would really love to hear from you guys is, what would you have done in the drafting had you been given the choices that we talked about? And what would you do with these cards, and how would you set them up in Year 1, Year 2, and Year 3 if these were your 9? The reason that I chose this is, first, the Amulet of Air is going to be great to help us increase our summoning gauge from the very beginning. The low cost of Figrim, while not generating a ton of crystals, will, potentially when we get him out, generate crystals for us moving forward. So we're going to have to find a way to generate crystals to get Figrim out, because he's going to cost us 3. Well, what better way than the Elemental Amulet if we were to be able to pay with Earth and gain 5 crystals for that? So that's why I would start off with those 3 in Year 1. Then when you move into Year 2, you're hoping to have more crystals, and you're hoping to have more energy as well. So what we're going to be looking at for then is a way to manipulate some things in our advantage. So the first thing we would look at is the Air Elemental to completely mess with our opponents. Then Narya to be able to draw cards and possibly put some more magical items into play. And then Amsug to be able to pull a magical item back to our hand, which could potentially be either of the amulets to give us another come into play ability when we were to cast it again a second time. Then finally we've got the 3rd year, which is Mirror of the Seasons, the Pendant of Ragnar, and the Balance of Ishtar. And the goal here would be to play the Balance of Ishtar first, followed by the Mirror of Seasons, and then the Pendant of Ragnar to be able to gain as much bonus for magical items that we have in play. So, again, this is just an example. We'd love to hear from you what you would do if these were the 9 cards that you had access to. So let's take a look at the 9 cards our green player got. Our green player got the Cursed Treaties of Aris, the Amulet of Air, the Amulet of Fire, the Thieving Fairies, the Potion of Life, another Amsug, the Potion of Dreams, the Potion of Life as a second copy, and the Sealed Chest of Urm. So again, not quite what they were hoping for, but still playable and something that could help us down the road. And let's take a look at each of the years and why this could be a setup. Well, to begin with, again, the Cursed Treaty of Aris is a gamble. It only is going to cost us 1 water to put in play, and it's going to gain us 2 energy tokens and 10 crystals. It's going to increase our summoning gauge, which is good early in the game. But if the Cursed Trees of Aris is sacrificed, then we have to discard all the energy tokens in our reserve. Now, as you may imagine, if you have no energy tokens in your reserve, that's not that bad of a thing. So potentially that could be a good play for us if we time it right. We also get an Amulet of Air and an Amulet of Fire, both of which have come into play abilities helping us to increase our summoning gauge and draw more cards. So from the very first year, we have the potential to increase our summoning gauge by 3 and draw extra cards with the Amulet of Fire, which is a really powerful starting setup depending on how the dice are rolled. Now, of course, in the second half here, in the third year, or second year and third year, we have some challenging choices to make. The first thing you'll notice in the 3rd year is we have the Sealed Chest of Urm. And at the end of the game, if you only have magic items in play, you gain 20 crystals. Well, we ended up with 2 familiars, which could be challenging. But let's take a look. These familiars would give us 14 crystals, versus the 20 that the Chest of Urm would give us as a bonus. So it's not that bad of a trade-off. We're losing a net of 6 if we put those guys into play. So the question becomes, can the Thieving Fairies possibly net me enough crystals, Or, using Amsug, is there a way to net me crystals to potentially get enough points to make up for that? Well, one of the combos we haven't even talked about yet is potentially using Amsug to pull back the Cursed Treaty of Aris into our hand. That won't sacrifice it, but it will remove the -10 from our score. Remember though, if you have cards in your hand at the end of the game, they're -5. If your choice is -10 or -5, I'd much rather have the -5. Then in our third year, we have a Potion of Dreams, which will sacrifice it and discard all of our energy to summon a power card for free, so potentially use the Sealed Chest of Urm to summon it for free. Another Potion of Life, and then the Sealed Chest of Urm. So not the greatest year 3, but remember, we have the Amulet of Fire to draw us additional cards, and the option of having some things down the road which could change our late game strategy. So, once again, I would love to hear from everybody. What would you have drafted if you were that green player? And what would you do if these were the 9 cards that you had to separate into years 1, years 2, and years 3? This is by no means the end of the discussion. This is just the beginning. And we want to hear from you guys what you think about these cards we've shown you. In addition, there's some cards we haven't talked about yet, which I'd like to take a second and share with you. Let's go ahead and talk about a couple of cards that we didn't see, but could be very powerful choices when drafting. First is the Hourglass of Time. The Hourglass of Time is going to be one of each element, and it says each time the season changes, you gain 1 energy token of your choice. Now you'll notice it says each time the season changes, not each time it's progressed forward. This is one of the key things about the Hourglass of Time, making it so powerful, because there are other cards that will move the season marker forward or backward, so if you keep bouncing across a line, you're going to keep gaining from that, which is really interesting. Of course, it is going to cost you 1 of each energy, so it could be potentially hazardous to bring out in the beginning of the game, but if you can get it, it's very, very powerful. Next is Zhang's Forgotten Vase. This is one of my favorite cards in the game. It costs a water, an earth, and a fire. And whenever you summon a power card, you gain 1 energy token. If you can get this out, and you can get this out early, this can be a very, very big deal breaker. Then there's the Divine Chalice, which hands down is my favorite card in the game. This is going to cost 1 of each element, and it'll say draw 4 power cards, summon 1 for free, and discard the other cards. Extremely powerful in years 2 and years 3. If you can do it in year 1, it's amazing. But years 2 and year 3, that is a great card to draft for. And then additionally, I wanted to show you these two. We have Olaf's Blessed Statue and the Amulet of Earth. One will cost you 3 water and gain you 20 crystals, and the other will cost you 2 earth and gain you 9. If you're going to go with a very heavy familiar deck or a heavy familiar strategy, they're great cards to draft because usually familiars that are powerful will cost you crystals to come into play. And gaining those early are really good choices as well. We hope that you've liked this critical situation and it's shown you a little bit of things inside of Seasons as to why you may or may not want to choose certain types of cards. We want to hear from you as well. By no means am I an expert on Seasons. I just like playing it a lot. These would have been my choices, but I'm curious to hear what your choices would have been as well. Let me know what you would have thought about the draft, and let me know what you would have thought about your years 1, year 2, and year 3. As always, we love to hear from all of our fans from all over the globe, so feel free to leave your comments here in the YouTube channel. You can of course find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Google Plus by searching Crits Happen, or at our homepage at critshappen.com. But until we see you next time, we hope you keep rolling all those dice, and they're all crits.